In tonight's episode, we have two chilling stories to uncover from Asia, each one carrying whispers that refuse to fade. The first takes us to Bangkok, Thailand, inside the walls of one of the country's most respected universities. Thammasat University is known for producing scholars, activists, and leaders. But when the sun sets and the campus falls quiet, a different reputation takes hold. One that is whispered about in hushed voices, never spoken too loudly, as if saying it outright might invite something closer. Students call it the library ghost. By day, the old library is a place of knowledge, filled with the quiet rhythm of turning pages and anxious exam preparation. But by night, it becomes something else entirely. The air turns sharp and cold in a city that almost never cools. Books slide off shelves, as if touched by unseen hands. And in the narrow aisles, a figure is said to stand perfectly still, waiting. A young woman in a white blouse, her chest marked with a spreading stain, the kind that looks like blood. They say she was one of the many who died during the violent protests of 1976, and that she never left. Thammasat University sits in the center of Bangkok, surrounded by busy streets, the constant hum of motorcycles, and the scent of street food drifting on the evening air. It is a place alive with energy during the day, a symbol of Thailand's pursuit of knowledge and progress. But at night, the mood shifts. When the classroom's empty and the chatter dies away, the silence that falls over the campus feels too heavy, as if the ground itself remembers everything that has happened there. Our story follows a young student, someone caught between the pressure of exams and the weight of history that hangs over this place. Her name drifts through whispers on campus, told by friends of friends who insist her experience was real. She had chosen the old library as her refuge, a place to study late into the night without distraction. By day, the library is unremarkable, its cracked white walls blending into the rest of the university's older buildings. But once the sun dropped behind the city skyline, she noticed details others often ignored. The way the hallways seemed darker than they should be, the way the air turned icy as soon as she pushed open the doors. Inside, the building still smelled faintly of dust and ink, though the typewriters and old machines had been removed decades ago. Shelves towered overhead, stacked with books whose spines had yellowed with age. The lamps hanging from the ceiling buzzed faintly, their light always just a little too dim, as if straining against the darkness that clung to the corners of the room. She sat at one of the long wooden tables near the back, her notebooks spread wide, her pen scratching across the page as she tried to drown out her anxiety with work. The library was not empty. A few other students lingered at first, though they avoided the back shelves, choosing to sit closer to the entrance where the light felt stronger. They whispered to each other, exchanged nervous glances, and eventually packed their bags much earlier than planned. By the time the old clock on the wall struck midnight, she realized she was alone. The echo of her own breathing filled the space, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling into the night. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. The silence seemed too deep, as if it were hiding something. She felt the temperature drop in waves, sudden and unnatural, crawling across her skin. She told herself it was exhaustion, the stress of studying too hard, the way the brain plays tricks when it is deprived of sleep. But, even as she tried to ignore it, her eyes kept flicking toward the darkened aisles between the shelves. There was history here, and everyone at Thammasat knew it. The protests of 1976 had turned the university into a site of horror. Young activists were beaten, shot, and killed on these very grounds. Some stories even claimed their bodies were dragged into the library itself, hidden in the chaos. Generations of students carried that memory like an open wound, and many believed it had seeped into the walls of the building, refusing to let go. Our student had grown up hearing fragments of those stories but never believed them. Ghosts were for folklore, for villages in the countryside, not for the center of Bangkok where neon lights drowned out the stars. Yet now, sitting in the cold hush of the library, she felt the past pressing close, as though something was standing just beyond her vision. She tried to focus on her notes, but her hand trembled as she wrote. The lamps above flickered once, twice, and then steadied. The sound of her pen scratching against paper seemed too loud, echoing strangely, as though someone else was mimicking her movements a few steps away. This was the moment she realized she was not alone. The first sign was so small she almost ignored it. A faint thud echoed through the stacks. The kind of sound a heavy book makes when it slips from a shelf and lands flat on the floor. She looked up sharply, her eyes scanning the aisles behind her. Nothing moved. The lamps still glowed with their weak, buzzing light, and the rows of books stood motionless in their places. She told herself it was natural. Old buildings creak, books shift, things fall. But in that silence, the noise seemed to linger longer than it should, as if the air itself was holding it. She stood, her chair scraping against the wooden floor, and walked cautiously toward the back shelves. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, each one followed by what sounded like another, softer step just behind her. She froze, listening. The echo stopped. Heart pounding, she turned the corner into the next aisle. A single book lay on the floor, splayed open as if someone had dropped it in haste. She picked it up, brushing the dust from its cover, and noticed the title was nearly rubbed away. It was an old history text, filled with accounts of student movements, political unrest, and the protests that had once shaken the nation. The very protests that had ended in violence here at Thammasat. The pages fluttered as she closed it, even though there was no breeze. She set it back on the shelf, determined not to let her imagination get the better of her. Back at her desk, she forced herself to return to her notes. Minutes passed. The clock ticked toward 1 in the morning. Then it happened again. Another thud, this time louder, closer, as if the book had fallen just behind her. She spun around, but the aisle was empty. No book on the ground, no sign of movement. Her throat felt dry, and she whispered to herself, "It's nothing, just the building." But the words sounded too loud in the stillness, bouncing off the shelves in a way that made her skin crawl. She packed her things quickly, sliding her notebook and pens into her bag, and considered leaving. Yet something held her there. The library was supposed to be safe, a place of study, of knowledge. Running away would mean admitting the stories might be true, and she wasn't ready for that. Instead, she decided to move closer to the entrance, where the air felt less heavy. She gathered her books and walked quickly across the room. Halfway there, she froze. A whisper curled through the silence, a soft, drawn-out sound, almost like her name. She spun toward the shelves, eyes wide, heart hammering in her chest. "Hello?" she called, her voice unsteady. No answer. The whisper came again, this time from the opposite side. Closer, more distinct. Definitely her name. She clutched her bag to her chest and backed toward the nearest table. It was then she noticed something else. The air wasn't just cold anymore. It was icy, like stepping into a freezer, her breath faintly visible in the dim glow of the lamps. Her skin prickled, and the hairs on her arms stood on end. She sat down quickly, trying to steady her breathing, convincing herself it was exhaustion, a trick of her tired mind. But then, the sound of typing filled the air. The sharp, rhythmic clack of typewriter keys, striking metal. She froze, every muscle in her body tense. The sound came from the archive room in the back corner of the library, a place that had long been cleared of the machines. She knew that room was empty. She had walked past it earlier. Still, the typing continued, steady and deliberate, like someone working late into the night. Curiosity warred with fear. She rose slowly, each step hesitant, drawn toward the sound. The closer she got, the louder the typing became, echoing unnaturally as though more than one machine were at work. She reached the doorway, her hand trembling as she touched the frame and peered inside. The room was empty. Nothing but old tables and stacks of unused files. The sound stopped the moment she crossed the threshold. Silence pressed in once more, heavier than before, as if the building itself were holding its breath. She backed away quickly, her heart pounding in her ears. Returning to her desk, she sat down and stared at the floor, trying to convince herself to leave. But her body wouldn't move. Something about the silence felt wrong now, too watchful, as if unseen eyes were fixed on her every motion. The lamps flickered again, casting quick shadows that darted across the aisles. In one of them, just for a second, she thought she saw movement, a figure standing between the shelves. A shape too still, too solid to be a trick of the light. She blinked, and it was gone. But the image burned in her mind, the outline of a young woman, her blouse pale against the darkness, a dark stain spreading across her chest. Her hands shook as she tried to continue writing, but the pen slipped, ink blotting the page. She no longer cared about exams, about notes, about anything but making it to the exit. Yet, as she glanced toward the doors, she realized how far away they seemed. The distance stretched unnaturally, as if the library itself had expanded, trapping her inside. And then, once more, she heard it, her name, spoken softly, directly behind her chair. This time, she didn't dare turn around. Her hands clutched the edge of the desk as if holding on could protect her. The voice that whispered her name lingered in the air like smoke. Impossible to trace, but impossible to ignore. She sat frozen, staring at her notebook, refusing to look over her shoulder. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body would not obey. Then, slowly, she heard it again. Not a whisper this time, but the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, pacing between the shelves. They moved with purpose, stopping, then starting again, circling as though someone or something was searching for her. She forced herself to turn, but the aisles were empty. The shadows stretched long and hollow, hiding nothing but dust and books. Still, the footsteps continued, though no figure walked there. Her heart hammered in her chest as she decided to pack her bag once more. This time she would leave. Enough was enough. She grabbed her things and made her way toward the front of the library, every step feeling heavier than the last. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, the exit pulling further away instead of closer. Halfway across the room, a voice broke the silence. It was not the whisper she had heard before. This was louder, clearer, a male voice. "Don't stay." She spun around, her breath caught in her throat. For the first time that night, she wasn't alone. A young man stood at one of the tables near the back, his face pale, his expression grim. She hadn't seen him before, hadn't noticed anyone come in. He looked like another student, books spread out before him, notes scattered on the table, but his eyes never left hers. They were dark, unblinking, filled with a seriousness that cut through the haze of fear clouding her mind. "Did you say something?" she asked, her voice cracking. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't be here." The lamps flickered overhead, and in that brief stutter of light, his outline blurred. When the glow steadied again, he was sitting perfectly still, as though he had never moved at all. She felt her chest tighten. Was he real? A fellow student working late, just like her, or something else entirely? Before she could ask again, a loud crash split the silence. One of the heavy shelves toward the far end of the library had toppled forward, its books scattering across the floor in a violent wave. She gasped, her eyes wide, but the young man did not flinch. He merely turned his head, as if watching something she could not see. And then she saw it. A shadow slipped between the aisles, tall and unmistakably human, though its form seemed to ripple against the dim light. The air dropped again, colder than ever before, her breath visible as she backed away from the sight. The young man stood. His voice was calm, almost flat. "Don't answer it if it calls again." She opened her mouth to speak, to demand what he meant, but the whisper returned. Her name. Closer than before. This time it came not from the aisles, but from directly beside her ear. She staggered backward, clutching her bag, her pulse racing, the man's eyes fixed on her. "It's not who you think it, Island." Her legs trembled, her mind spinning. She wanted to ask, to scream, to understand, but fear anchored her tongue. She stumbled toward the doors, desperate to reach them. But with every step, the echo of typing returned, surrounding her from all sides, as though dozens of unseen hands were hammering keys in unison. The aisles darkened. The shelves seemed to lean inward, closing the path, funneling her deeper instead of out. She turned to find another route, but the young man was gone. His table sat empty. The books and notes vanished as though he had never been there. Only his warning remained, echoing in her mind. "Don't answer it." She pressed on, every sense stretched thin, the shadows growing thicker with each flicker of the lamps. Somewhere behind her, the voice called her name again, louder now, urgent. Familiar, even, as if it was someone she knew, someone she trusted. Her steps faltered. What if it was real? What if someone needed her? The memory of the young man's words pulled her back. "It's not who you think it, Island." She tightened her grip on her bag and forced herself forward, resisting the temptation to turn toward the voice. The doors were finally in sight. She ran, her footsteps echoing across the floor. Just as her hand reached for the handle, a cold breath brushed against her neck, and the voice whispered her name one last time, longer, stretched, almost pleading. She froze. For a moment she felt torn between leaving and answering, between safety and something she could not explain. The air around her grew heavy, pressing down, and she realized the choice might not be hers to make. Her hand hovered over the door handle, trembling so hard she could hear the faint rattle of metal against metal. Every instinct screamed at her to pull, to leave, to escape into the night air where motorcycles and laughter still echoed faintly from the streets outside, yet she couldn't move. The voice clung to her ears, low and intimate, curling into the space between her thoughts. It whispered her name again, this time softer, coaxing, almost tender. She squeezed her eyes shut, telling herself to ignore it, to remember the warning. But then something shifted. The air, once cold, grew unbearably heavy. Her chest tightened, each breath shallow, as though the library itself was suffocating her. She forced her eyes open and froze. The long rows of shelves had changed. Instead of orderly stacks of books, she saw torn banners, bloodied posters, and broken furniture. The walls seemed to ripple, overlaid with visions of chaos. The room was no longer just a library. It was a battlefield. She saw flashes of students running, their white shirts stained crimson, the echoes of shouts and gunfire reverberating through the stillness. The past and present collided before her eyes, turning the library into a monument of violence and grief. And in the center of it all, the figure appeared. A young woman stood between the aisles, motionless, her head tilted slightly as though studying her. The blouse she wore was the crisp white uniform of a student, but across her chest bloomed a dark red stain that seemed to spread with every flicker of the lamps. Her hair hung loosely around her face, and her eyes, dark, hollow, endless, fixed on the student with a weight that made her knees buckle. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't behind her. It was from the figure. The lips moved, soundless at first, and then, with a force that rattled the shelves, the word cut through the silence. Her name. The girl staggered back, her bag slipping from her grip and thudding against the floor. Her pulse roared in her ears. She wanted to scream, but the sound lodged in her throat. The ghost took a step forward, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath her feet. Books cascaded from the shelves, slamming to the floor around her, the noise deafening. One by one, the lamps above shattered, plunging the room into bursts of darkness broken only by sudden flashes of dim light. In each flash, the ghost was closer, moving without motion, as if she belonged to the darkness itself. The student stumbled backward, desperate to put distance between them, but the library twisted again. The exit doors were gone, replaced by walls of shelves that stretched endlessly, trapping her inside. She turned down one aisle, then another, but each path only led her deeper into the maze. The whispers multiplied, dozens of voices now, all calling her name, overlapping, echoing until she could no longer tell where they came from. Her legs shook as she pressed herself against a shelf, her nails digging into the wood. Across from her, the pale figure appeared once more, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her stretched the outlines of countless others, shadowy figures with blank faces and hollow eyes, students frozen in their final moments. Some clutched books, others bore wounds that never healed, their bodies translucent, yet weighted with anguish. She realized then what the young man's warning had meant. These were not voices of comfort. They were remnants, trapped between time and death, pulling anyone who listened closer to their fate. The ghost raised her hand slowly, pointing directly at her. The whispers ceased, leaving only silence, suffocating and absolute. Then the sound of typewriter keys erupted again, louder than ever, echoing from every corner of the library. The rhythm was frantic now, violent, like the frantic tapping of someone trying to scream through words. Her heart raced as she clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound bored straight into her skull. She stumbled forward, disoriented, only to find herself standing before one of the old tables. On its surface sat a typewriter that hadn't been there moments ago, its keys slamming down on their own. Letters appeared on the yellowed sheet of paper threaded through it, forming words she couldn't ignore. It typed her name. Over and over, her vision blurred with tears, and she spun, desperate to run, but the ghost was there, only inches away now, her hollow eyes staring into hers. Up close, the stain on her blouse was no longer just a mark. It was a wound, fresh and gaping, as if the blood was still spilling. The smell of iron filled the air, thick and suffocating. The student's back hit the wall, nowhere left to go. The figure leaned closer, her cold breath brushing against her skin. For the first time, the whisper wasn't her name. It was a question. Low and rasping, spoken as though dragged from the grave itself. Will you stay? The girl's mind reeled, the weight of history and death pressing down on her shoulders. She realized then that this wasn't just a haunting, it was an invitation. The library was not merely filled with ghosts, it was hungry for more, and now it had chosen her. The question hung in the air like smoke. Will you stay? The student pressed herself harder against the wall, her lungs refusing to fill, her body trembling as though every nerve had turned against her. The ghost's eyes were no longer hollow. They were searching, demanding, as if waiting for her to give in. But then, just as her knees threatened to give way, she heard something familiar. A voice. Not the ghost's, not the chorus of whispers, but the steady, calm tone of the young man she had seen earlier. His words were not shouted. They cut through the chaos like a blade. Don't answer. Her head snapped toward the sound, and there he was again, standing between the shelves. Only now his presence looked different. His skin was pale, too pale, the outline of his figure faint, almost translucent. In that moment she understood. He had never been another student like her. He was one of them, a ghost bound to this place. The revelation hit her with icy clarity. That was why he had warned her. He knew what happened when the living listened, when they gave in to the voices that called. He had once been like her, trapped in the library, perhaps lured by the same whispers, until he became part of the echoing mass that filled the aisles. The pale figure of the young woman still loomed before her, her wound dark and glistening. The typewriter clacked louder and faster, the sheet of paper filled now with a single repeated line, "Stay with us." The student's chest heaved. Her mind replayed every event of the night, the books that had fallen, the icy drafts through closed windows, the whispers of her name, the typewriter that should not exist. None of it had been random. Each was a step in the same direction, a series of hooks designed to pull her closer, to weaken her resistance, until the final question could be asked. Will you stay? This was not about haunting for the sake of fear. It was recruitment. The dead, restless and unacknowledged, wanted company. They wanted more voices to join the endless chorus trapped within the library's walls. The young man's eyes locked on hers, urgent but calm. It doesn't stop once you say yes. It never stops. She swallowed hard, tears burning her eyes. The weight of the library's history pressed on her. She thought of the protests of 1976, of the students who had marched with ideals of justice and change, only to be met with unimaginable violence. They had died young, their voices silenced. But here, in this space, they refused to disappear. A part of her almost understood. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted the living to know their pain, to feel the injustice that had cut their lives short. But understanding didn't lessen the terror. If she answered, if she agreed to stay, she would become one of them, forever caught in the loop, whispering her name to the next unlucky soul who wandered in. The lamps above sparked violently, showering fragments of glass across the floor. In the darkness that followed, the pale woman's face hovered inches from her own. The wound glistened wet, fresh as though the moment of death was repeating itself eternally. The student squeezed her eyes shut. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. The air shuddered, a low rumble filling the space. The figure's expression twisted, not into rage, but into something sad, almost mournful. The chorus of whispers rose, layered and desperate, as if pleading with her to reconsider. But through it all, the young man's voice remained steady, guiding her. "Keep walking, don't look back." Her legs shook as she forced herself to move. The aisles stretched endlessly, twisting, reforming, but with each step she focused on the door she had seen before, imagining it, willing it into existence. The whispers clawed at her mind, growing louder, turning into screams. Still, she pressed forward. At last, the heavy wooden doors appeared ahead of her, faint in the dark like a mirage. She stumbled toward them, every step a battle, until her hand met the cold metal handle. Behind her, the pale woman's voice cried out, no longer whispering, but shouting with the pain of generations silenced. "Remember us." The sound pierced her chest, and for a split second she almost turned back. Almost. But she remembered the warning. "Don't answer. Don't stay." She wrenched the door open and stepped into the night. The instant she crossed the threshold, the weight lifted. The air filled her lungs freely again. The warm humidity of Bangkok enveloped her, sticky and real, so different from the suffocating chill of the library. She turned back quickly, half expecting the figure to follow. But the building loomed in silence, its windows dark, its walls indifferent. Her body trembled as she staggered down the steps, clutching her bag to her chest. She understood now what others had only whispered about. The library was not just haunted. It was a trap, a monument built on blood that still demanded more. And those who heard their names called inside, those who gave in, they never walked back out. She didn't stop moving until the glow of the streetlights reached her skin. Only then did she collapse onto a nearby bench, gasping, her heart still thundering as though it hadn't realized she had escaped. Students wandered past on the sidewalks, laughing, chatting, living in a world that felt impossibly normal. None of them could see what still lingered behind those library walls. None of them could feel the weight of that voice in their ear, the pull of history demanding they join it. She stared at the building, its dark windows reflecting nothing, and wondered how many others had stood where she had. How many had answered? How many were still inside, their whispers twisting through the aisles, waiting for someone new to arrive? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out with shaking hands, desperate for something ordinary. A message blinked across the screen, sent from an unknown number. 4 simple words. Will you stay tonight? Her throat tightened, her vision swam. She dropped the phone as if it had burned her. The sound of it clattering against the concrete seemed too loud, too sharp, echoing far longer than it should. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the silence didn't come. Somewhere deep inside the library, typewriter keys were still clacking, steady, relentless, spelling out her name again and again. She stood quickly, leaving the phone behind, her only thought to get as far away as possible. But even as she walked into the neon-lit streets of Bangkok, one question gnawed at her chest. If she had said no, and still the voices followed, what would happen the next time she returned to the campus? And worse, what if the library wasn't asking for her anymore? What if it had already decided the answer? The story of Thammasat's library shows us how history refuses to stay buried, how the dead still reach out to the living in search of recognition. But it isn't the only campus where young lives, cut short too soon, have left something behind. Across Asia, universities are not just places of ambition and knowledge, they are also places of pressure, of silence, of tragedy. And where tragedy takes root, ghosts often follow. Our next story takes us north, to Beijing, where one of China's most prestigious universities hides a dormitory with a reputation so dark that students whisper about it before they even arrive. A room where the cries of one night long ago never stopped, and where a balcony still waits for the return of the girl who leapt from it. Beijing is a city that never truly sleeps. Traffic hums long past midnight, neon signs flicker over crowded food stalls, and students spill out of classrooms with notebooks in hand, chasing the weight of impossible expectations. At the heart of it all stands Tsinghua University, one of the country's most prestigious institutions. For generations, it has been a symbol of pride, its graduates celebrated for shaping China's future. But beneath its reputation for excellence, there is another story whispered among the students. A story no official tour guide mentions. A story that begins with a single dormitory. Our focus turns to a first-year student, a young man whose name varies depending on who tells it. Sometimes he is called Wei, sometimes Jun, but always he is described the same. Hard-working, bright, determined not to waste the opportunity he had earned. Like so many who passed through Tsinghua's gates, he carried the pressure of his family's expectations, the weight of being the one who would succeed. For him, the dormitory was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to rest between lectures, group projects, and late nights of study. He had no reason to believe it would become something else. The dormitory building itself was plain, a block of concrete and glass like countless others across the campus. Its white walls were weathered by Beijing's heavy summers and frigid winters, its corridors echoing with the footsteps of students moving between rooms. Yet there was one corner of the building that seemed different. A wing where doors stayed locked longer than others, where students hesitated to walk at night, and where a single room, tucked against a balcony, carried a reputation older than any of its current residents. Wei didn't think much of the rumors at first. He heard them in passing during orientation, whispered by seniors who smirked as though the stories were only meant to scare newcomers. They spoke of a girl who had once lived there decades ago, a young engineering student crushed under the relentless demand for perfection. When the pressure became too much, she climbed onto her balcony and leapt into the darkness. Her body was buried, but her spirit, they said, never left. Wei listened, smiled nervously, and dismissed it as campus folklore. Ghost stories existed everywhere, didn't they? And yet, when the key in his hand matched the very room from the whispers, he felt something shift inside him. His new roommates laughed when they heard. "It's just a story," they said, tossing their bags on the bunks. If it were true, the university wouldn't let anyone live here. But their laughter was nervous, thin, the kind of sound meant to cover unease. Wei tried to join them, but his eyes drifted toward the balcony door. The curtains swayed slightly even though the window was shut. By day, the room seemed ordinary enough. 4 bunks lined the walls, desks cluttered with notebooks and instant noodle cups, posters of celebrities and formulas pinned above beds. The hum of campus life drifted through the window, grounding the space in the comfort of the ordinary. But as night fell, that comfort slipped away. The hallway lights buzzed faintly outside, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch under the door. The temperature dipped in a way that felt unnatural, the air heavy and stale no matter how wide the windows were opened. Wei lay awake on his bunk during those first nights, staring at the ceiling as the sounds of the dormitory faded. Laughter from nearby rooms died down, footsteps disappeared, and the corridors grew silent. That was when he began to notice the details, the faint scratching on the wall beside his bed, soft and deliberate, as if someone were dragging their nails across plaster, the occasional tug at his blanket, gentle at first, then firmer, until he sat upright with his heart pounding. And sometimes, in the early hours, the muffled sound of a woman sobbing. At first, it seemed to come from outside the window, drifting upward from the courtyard below. But when he peered out through the glass, he saw nothing but the empty balcony and the darkness beyond. He told himself it was exhaustion, the stress of adapting to a new life, the tricks the mind plays in silence. But the longer he stayed in that room, the harder it became to believe his own excuses. For every night the sobbing returned, and each time it sounded a little closer. The first week passed with little more than unease. Wei pushed through his classes, filled his notebooks, and laughed along with his roommates when they teased him about living with the ghost. But at night, when the building settled and the campus grew quiet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the room. It began one evening just past midnight. The others had fallen asleep, their steady breathing filling the darkness, when Wei woke suddenly. He wasn't sure why. No noise had roused him, no movement from the bunks. Yet his eyes opened to a strange stillness. The air felt thick, pressing against his chest. He shifted, rolling onto his side, and that was when he heard it, a faint scratching sound just beyond his headboard. At first, he thought it was a mouse trapped inside the walls. But the sound wasn't erratic. It was steady, slow, deliberate, a rhythm of fingernails dragging across plaster. Scritch, scritch, scritch. His pulse quickened. He sat up, straining to hear, and the sound stopped instantly, as though the act of listening had silenced it. Wei lay back down, convincing himself it was his imagination. But when he closed his eyes, the scratching resumed. Louder this time, more insistent, tracing the wall beside him as if something unseen was marking a path. He pressed his palm against the cool surface, half expecting to feel movement beneath the paint, but there was nothing. Still, the sound continued until the first hint of dawn crept through the curtains, and only then did it fade away. The next morning, he tried to laugh it off, but exhaustion weighed heavily on him. At breakfast, one of his roommates noticed the shadows under his eyes. "You didn't sleep?" he asked, spoon clinking against his bowl. "Something was in the walls," Wei muttered. The roommate raised an eyebrow. "The mouse everyone talks about?" He grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Better that than the ghost." Wei wanted to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't sure which explanation terrified him more. That night, the scratching returned, joined by something new. As Wei pulled the blanket over himself, the fabric tugged sharply toward the foot of the bed. His first thought was that one of the others had grabbed it in their sleep. But when he looked down, their bodies were still, their hands tucked close. He pulled the blanket back up, heart pounding, only to feel it slide again. A firm, unmistakable tug, as if invisible fingers were peeling it away from him inch by inch. He sat bolt upright, clutching the blanket to his chest. The room was still. His roommates shifted slightly in their sleep, undisturbed. Wei's breathing came fast and shallow. Slowly, carefully, he let the fabric loosen in his grip. Nothing moved, but when he tried to lie back down, the blanket jerked once more, sharp enough to pull it entirely off his body. His skin prickled. He leaned over the edge of the bunk, scanning the floor. Nothing. No one. Only the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He scrambled to retrieve the blanket, pulling it tightly around him like a shield. Sleep didn't come until exhaustion forced it on him, just before sunrise. By the third night, he was too afraid to close his eyes. The scratching and tugging had become routine, as if part of the room's rhythm. But then came something worse. The sobbing. It began faintly, so soft he thought it was drifting in from outside. A woman's voice, broken and uneven, muffled as though carried by the wind. He sat up, listening, and the sound grew clearer. It wasn't from the courtyard below. It was outside the balcony. Wei's bunk faced the balcony door. The curtains were drawn, but he could see their faint outline against the pale moonlight. The sobbing pressed closer, directly beyond the glass, as if someone knelt just outside, weeping into the night. His body locked in place, too terrified to move, too curious not to listen. The sound rose, cracked, fell again. Sometimes it sounded young, almost childlike. Other times it was deeper, ragged with despair. He reached for the courage to wake his roommates, but his voice failed him. And then, slowly, the sobbing stopped. Silence filled the air once more. Relief washed over him until he saw it. From the gap at the edge of the curtain, a pale hand gripped the balcony rail. Its fingers were long, thin, bone-white in the moonlight, clutching tightly before slipping away into the air. Wei's blood ran cold. He stumbled back against the headboard, his heart hammering so loudly he thought it might wake the others. But no one stirred. They slept peacefully, as though nothing had happened. Only he had seen it. Only he had heard her. And for the first time, Wei realized the stories weren't just tales passed between students. The girl who had leapt all those years ago was still here, and she was watching. Wei told himself he could endure it, that it was just stress or maybe some strange dream bleeding into reality. But the next nights shattered whatever excuses he had left. The dormitory had turned against him, and now it wanted him to know it. The sobbing on the balcony became a nightly ritual. Sometimes it was faint, drifting like mist. Other times it was sharp, raw, the kind of sound that pierced through the chest. On the fourth night, when the clock ticked past 2, Wei sat frozen on his bunk while the weeping built louder and louder until it seemed to seep straight through the glass. He stared at the curtains, certain that if he pulled them back, he'd find someone kneeling there. He didn't dare touch them. But that wasn't the worst of it. The scratching on the wall returned, and this time it didn't stay in one place. It moved. Starting at his headboard, it crawled along the wall, down toward the floor, across to his desk, and then upward again, as though circling the room. His roommate slept undisturbed, but Wei sat rigid, his pulse racing with every scrape. The sound stopped only when it reached the balcony door. The following morning, Wei tried to confide in one of his roommates, a tall boy named Jian, who rarely took anything seriously. Wei described the scratching, the blanket tugging, the sobbing on the balcony. Jian listened, smirking, until Wei mentioned the pale hand. At that, the smirk faltered. You saw it? Jian asked, his tone shifting. Wei frowned. You believe me? Jian leaned closer, lowering his voice. Don't talk about it too loudly. People say, if you acknowledge her too much, she pays more attention. Wei stared at him. You mean you've heard the stories too? Jian nodded, his expression uneasy now. Everyone's heard them, but most people joke about it because it's easier. My cousin studied here 10 years ago. He told me about this room. Said his friend lasted only 3 weeks before transferring. Every night the same thing, scratching, crying, things moving on their own. He said the girl tries to make you notice her. Once you do, she doesn't let go. The words sank deep into Wei's chest. The ghost wasn't just haunting the room. She was searching, choosing. That night, Wei couldn't concentrate on his notes. Every creak of the building set him on edge. His roommates tried to lighten the mood, playing cards and laughing loudly, but their laughter was too thin, too forced. They all felt it, even if no one admitted it. When the lights finally went out, Wei lay in silence, staring at the ceiling. Minutes crawled by, then came the sobbing, softer this time, almost hesitant. He squeezed his eyes shut, pretending not to hear. But then, something different, a whisper. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but slowly the words took shape. A woman's voice, hoarse and broken, drifting through the room. Don't look. Don't look. His breath caught. She wasn't just crying anymore, she was speaking, warning him. Or was it a trick? Wei sat upright, scanning the room. His roommates were still asleep. The voice came again, closer this time, the words rattling like brittle bones. Don't look. Don't look. The curtains swayed as if touched from the outside. Wei's stomach twisted. He wanted to wake the others, to flee, but fear pinned him in place. Then Jian stirred. Half asleep. Annoyed. He muttered, For God's sake, stop crying, before rolling onto his side. The sobbing ceased instantly. Silence swallowed the room. Wei's blood froze. The air felt heavy, charged, as though the entire building was holding its breath. And then, from the balcony, came a sound so sharp it made him flinch, a fingernail dragging slowly across the glass, long, deliberate, screeching. His heart pounded as the nail scraped again, harder this time, tracing an invisible line across the window. Jian sat bolt upright now, wide awake, his face pale. Did you hear that? He whispered. Wei could only nod, his throat dry. The scraping stopped. For a moment, silence. Then came a sudden, violent bang against the glass, as though something had thrown itself at the balcony door. The curtains bulged inward, the rod above rattling against the wall. Both boys jumped from their bunks, stumbling back, their breaths ragged. But just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The curtains hung still, the air returned to its suffocating quiet. Wei and Jian exchanged a glance, their faces drained of color. Whatever haunted their room wasn't content with whispers anymore. It wanted to be seen. And the question neither dared to ask hung heavy in the silence. What would happen if one of them finally pulled those curtains back? The room had never felt so small. The 4 bunks pressed in on them, the air thick and unmoving, as if the entire dormitory had shifted from a place of rest to a sealed chamber of dread. Wei and Jian stood in the faint glow of the hallway light seeping under the door, both too afraid to move, too afraid to look at the balcony. The silence after the violent bang was worse than the noise itself. It stretched long and heavy, pressing into their ears until the smallest sound made them flinch. Then it came again, the sobbing. But this time it wasn't outside, it was inside. The 2 boys froze, their eyes darting to the corner near the balcony curtains. The sobbing began low, muffled, like someone trying to stifle their cries. But with each breath it grew louder, deeper, until it filled the room entirely. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere, wrapping around them, making the hairs on their arms rise. Jian grabbed Wei's arm. "We can't stay here," he whispered, his voice trembling, but Wei couldn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the curtains. They were moving again, but not with the gentle sway of air. They pulsed, rising and falling, as though someone were standing just behind them, breathing heavily. Wei's body shook. "Do you see it?" Jian nodded slowly. "Don't touch it. Don't." His words cut off as a pale shape pressed against the fabric. At first, it looked like the outline of a hand, fingers spread wide, nails scraping faintly against the glass behind. But then a second hand appeared beside it. Then a face. The curtain stretched forward, its fabric molding around the contours of a woman's features, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, lips parted in a silent cry. Wei stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting the bunk. Jian swore under his breath, backing away toward the door. The sobbing grew louder, echoing with layers of voices now, as if multiple throats were crying at once. The entire curtain shook violently, rattling against the window frame, until suddenly, silence. The fabric fell limp again. Wei's chest heaved. He felt a flicker of hope that maybe it was over, but then, in one sharp motion, the curtains ripped open. The balcony door stood wide, though no one had touched it. The night air rushed in, freezing and sharp, carrying with it the smell of dust and something sour, like old iron. And there she was. A young woman crouched on the balcony rail, her uniform skirt fluttering in the breeze, her long hair falling in tangled strands across her face. Her skin was pale, translucent under the moonlight, and across her wrists ran deep red gashes that never closed. She clung to the rail with both hands, her body swaying as though balanced between life and death. Wei's stomach dropped. She wasn't a shadow, wasn't just a voice. She was real enough to look at him. Her eyes lifted, empty and dark, locking onto his with a weight that made his knees buckle. Jian pressed himself against the far wall, whispering frantically, "Don't go near her. Don't speak. Don't." But his warning was drowned out by the girl's scream. It tore through the room like shattering glass, high-pitched and raw, the sound of a life ending and repeating all at once. Wei clutched his head, falling to his knees, his vision swimming. When he looked again, she was no longer on the rail. She was inside. Her figure flickered, one moment on the balcony, the next only a step away, her soaked hair dripping onto the floor. She reached toward him with her pale, shaking hands, her nails black and splintered, her lips moving as though trying to speak. Wei could only hear fragments, broken words swallowed by sobs. "Too much. Pressure. Can't breathe." His blood ran cold. She wasn't just haunting the dorm, she was reliving her last moments, trapped in an endless loop of despair, and anyone who stayed long enough was forced to witness it. Jian shouted, "Look away!" But Wei couldn't. The ghost's face was inches from his, her hollow eyes filled with tears that never fell. For a second, he felt himself pulled toward her, the weight of her sorrow dragging him down. He saw himself standing at the balcony rail, his hands gripping it tightly, the urge to leap stronger than any thought of resistance. Her hand brushed his cheek, freezing his skin. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice clearer now, pleading. "Don't leave me alone." Wei's breath caught. The words struck deep, twisting into the exhaustion and pressure he carried with him every day. He understood, in a way that terrified him, how someone could have reached this point. The lamps in the room flickered violently, casting the walls in stuttering shadows. The sobbing rose again, deafening, until it felt like dozens of voices were inside their heads. The balcony door slammed shut with a force that rattled the glass, though the ghost remained inside, cornering them. Wei and Jian pressed against the wall, their minds spinning, their bodies trembling. The girl loomed closer, her face twisted with grief and rage, her voice breaking. "Stay, stay, stay, stay." And in that moment, Wei realized the ghost wasn't asking. She was demanding. This was no longer her tragedy alone. It was an invitation, and it was aimed directly at him. The room quaked with her cries, the walls themselves seeming to vibrate beneath the weight of her despair. Wei's head pounded, his thoughts dissolving into static, but somewhere beneath the noise, a single thread of clarity began to pull through. The things she whispered, the fragments of words that cut between her sobs, weren't random. They were her story. Too much. Pressure. Can't breathe. Wei had heard words like those whispered in the dorm halls before. Students complaining about impossible exams, about the crushing weight of expectations. Only this voice didn't stop at complaint. It was a confession frozen in time, one that had never found release. Jian, pale and trembling, grabbed Wei by the arm. "Don't listen. She's pulling you in. That's what she does." But Wei's eyes stayed locked on the figure before him. Her face flickered in and out of focus, sometimes whole, sometimes a blur of pale light and shadow. She wasn't just trying to scare him. She was showing him something, forcing him to understand the cycle that had bound her here. Suddenly, a cold gust surged through the room, tossing papers from desks, rattling beds against the floor. The curtains flapped wildly, even though the balcony door was closed again. And then, from the chaos, another voice cut through, clear, steady. It was Jian's cousin, or rather, it was what remained of him. Wei blinked, and for the second time that week, he saw a boy who didn't belong standing in the room. His figure glowed faintly, his outline blurred by the shifting light. He wasn't solid, but he wasn't just shadow either. His presence was undeniable. "You can't stay here," the apparition said, his tone heavy with finality. "She doesn't want peace. She wants company." Wei's stomach twisted. "Company?" The ghost nodded once. "Every year, she reaches out to the new ones, scratches the walls, tugs the sheets, cries outside the glass. Little things at first. If you notice her, if you acknowledge her, then she knows you're listening. And once you listen, she doesn't let go." The girl's sobbing swelled again, more desperate, as if to drown out his words. She lunged forward, her form flickering, her hands outstretched. "Stay," she pleaded. "Stay with me." The cousin's ghost stepped between them. His figure shimmered like smoke, but somehow the girl recoiled, her face twisting in anguish. Wei's heart pounded as he finally understood the first strange events, the scratching, the blanket tugging, the whispering. None of it had been random. They weren't accidents, and they weren't warnings. They were invitations, bait. The ghost wasn't restless because she was trapped. She was restless because she was hunting for someone to replace her loneliness. Jian clutched Wei's sleeve, eyes wide. "You see him too, don't you?" Wei nodded slowly. The cousin's figure turned to them, his face unreadable. "You have to leave this room. Tonight. If you don't, she'll bind you. You'll hear her everywhere. In your sleep, in your blood, until you can't tell her voice from your own." A chill shot through Wei at the thought. He already felt her pulling at the edges of his mind, her sorrow sinking hooks into his exhaustion. If he stayed another night, would he even be able to resist? The girl's sobbing suddenly broke into laughter. It was a sound that didn't fit her face, shrill and jagged, tearing at the air. She slammed her hand against the wall, leaving behind a smear of shadow that seemed to seep into the plaster. The entire room shook, and the lights above burst one by one, sparks raining down in sharp flashes. Jian shouted, "We have to go!" Wei staggered toward the door, his body heavy as if fighting against invisible chains. The girl shrieked, the sound rattling his bones, and the balcony door flung open once more. She stood on the rail again, her hair whipping around her face, her eyes locked on his. "I won't be alone," she screamed. The cousin's ghost moved closer, his outline flickering violently. "Run, now." Wei didn't wait. He grabbed Jian's arm, and together they bolted for the door. The handle was ice cold in his hand, resisting his grip, but with a desperate wrench, it gave way. They stumbled into the corridor, the air outside warm compared to the freezing weight inside the room. Behind them, the door slammed shut, the echo reverberating through the entire dormitory. For a long moment, both boys stood doubled over, gasping for breath, their bodies shaking. The hallway lights buzzed faintly, too ordinary, too real. But Wei knew the truth now. The girl's spirit wasn't just a tragedy lingering out of grief. It was a cycle, a hunger that pulled new souls into her despair. Every scratching wall, every tugged sheet, every whispered cry, they were traps, carefully laid to make someone acknowledge her, to make them listen. And once they did, she would never stop calling. Wei and Jian didn't speak as they stumbled down the stairwell, their footsteps echoing through the concrete like gunshots. Neither dared to look back. The further they got from the cursed room, the lighter the air became, but the heaviness in their chests never left. By the time they burst through the dormitory doors into the night, sweat clung to their skin despite the cool breeze. For a long moment, they stood in silence beneath the glow of the campus street lamps. Around them, Beijing pulsed with life, bicycles rattled past, students laughed on their way back from late-night study halls, and the distant hum of traffic rolled over the university walls. It all felt impossible. How could the world carry on as if nothing had happened? When behind those windows, a ghost demanded to be heard. Jian finally broke the silence. "We can't stay there, not another night." Wei nodded, though his eyes were still fixed on the dark rectangle of their dormitory window. He thought he saw the curtain move, just a twitch, as if someone inside was watching them from above. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, and when he looked again, the window was still empty. Neither of them returned to that room. By morning, they had arranged to swap with another group of students. The official reason? Too noisy near the stairwell. No one pressed them for details. Everyone knew excuses were often just that, thin veils for something left unsaid. But Wei never stopped hearing it. At night, long after he had moved, he would wake suddenly, his ears straining against the silence. Sometimes he thought he caught it again, that faint scratching, that muffled sob. And one evening, as he returned from class, he found a folded note slipped between the pages of his notebook. 4 words, scrawled in hurried handwriting. "Don't look. Don't stay." The same warning he had once heard whispered in the dark. His hands shook as he read it. Because there was one question that note refused to answer. Had someone else left it for him? Or had she? I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you liked them and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.